Yeah, I've done a lot of research on donuts in the city, and I've even done a donut tour and taste test. And for me, the winner is the glazed donut at Destination Donuts. It's light and fluffy and delicious. The only donut I like is the glazed. So, all the fancy stuff on top of it, I don't need. A good glazed donut shows that you know how to make a good donut. For me, glazed is classic.
Welcome. This is Uncommon Sense, a CPA podcast presented by the Heshe CPA Knowledge Center. The center is an initiative of the CPA Education Foundation, the charitable arm of the chartered professional accountant profession in Alberta. For the record, this CPA podcast isn't about bean counting. Our episodes feature conversations with Alberta CPAs sharing their insights on a wide range of timely topics.
Hello, I'm Erin Schwartz, your host for this episode, and I'm joined by a very exciting guest today, chartered professional accountant Tina Thomas. Tina is the Chief Executive Officer at the Edmonton Community Foundation, the largest non-governmental funder of the charitable sector in Edmonton, granting over $35 million annually. Prior to her tenure at ECF, she spent over 13 years at the Edmonton Public Library, most recently as the Executive Director of Customer Experience. Before this, she spent 13 years in the private sector working for Canadian telecommunications provider Nortel. In addition to her CPA designation, Tina holds an executive MBA and a master's in library information science. She has been recognized and honored as an Edify magazine Top 40 Under 40, a library journal magazine Mover and Shaker, and an International Association of Business Educators Edmonton Communicator of the Year. Tina is with us to talk about her work in the not-for-profit sector and the importance of philanthropy and volunteerism in Alberta. Thanks for being here, Tina.
Thanks for having me.
So as I mentioned in that intro, you've had quite an interesting career path. You've got a handful of degrees, a professional designation, and a range of career experiences spanning private, public, and not-for-profit sectors. You are a self-proclaimed CPA who is not an accountant. Can you tell us about the journey that brought you to your current role as CEO of the Edmonton Community Foundation?
Yeah, I think I relate to what a lot of people in high school feel, whereas they don't know what they want to do when they grow up. And so I've said that pretty much my entire life. Like even now, I probably would say I don't know what I want to do when I grow up. So how I've really approached it, and again, it's easier to see these things when you look back on them, is being open to possibilities and being open to opportunities. So when I graduated from high school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I didn't love science and I didn't think arts would be a practical degree, so I went into business. And while I was in business, I didn't want to be an accountant. I didn't want to go into finance, so I didn't have a set path. And so I did a really generalist degree. I focused on marketing and international business, but then I took opportunities. So I went on a one-year exchange to England, and it was at the time that the EU was getting started. So I studied international business with classmates from all over Europe. And then I came back and I joined the co-op program. And then through that, I had the chance to work both for the federal government and then for Nortel in telecommunications. So it kind of gave me the opportunity to try a lot of things before I finished my degree. And really, it's the only reason I got a job when I graduated, because every other person I know that wasn't in accounting or wasn't in finance or wasn't in HR didn't have a clear path. None of them got jobs. And I got a job and, it brought me to Ottawa working for Nortel. And I thought I'd stay there for 2 years. I didn't think it was long-term for me, but I loved it. I started at the time that telecommunications was really booming across the world. So Nortel was such a fantastic company for me. It gave me so many opportunities to try different things. So, I got to experience the full gamut of marketing, whether that is marketing communications and public relations and developing media campaigns for giant multinational product or service launches, to leading an analytics team where we were looking at the research and assessment, influencing market analysts in New York about our market position and how they should be changing how they classify the products and services we provide. So it was such an exciting opportunity. And while I was at Nortel, they also gave me the chance to do my MBA. And so while I was doing my MBA, I was in that market analysis position. And that's really where kind of that creative analytical piece came in. And I thought pursuing my accounting designation would make sense. I didn't love accounting in my undergrad, but when I did it as part of my MBA, it was my financial accounting and my management accounting classes were my best scores. And I really resonated with the logic of it. So that's what made me kind of pursue doing my accounting designation with my MBA. But pretty quickly after, I changed roles and it just didn't become a component of my day-to-day work. So after, trying a bunch of different areas at Nortel, working in a bunch of different sectors, I had the unfortunate experience of living through a giant, one of the largest companies in Canada, the largest patent holder in North America. I got to live through the demise. So I think I went through about 12 rounds of layoffs with them. And by the time they were getting to their end, I was pregnant and decided it's time to move closer to home. So I moved back to Edmonton and stayed working for Nortel. And then I decided it's time for me to leave. Like, this is not for me anymore. That constant living under the gun, having, good work that you're doing and good people that you're working with no longer be around, just wasn't the environment for me. And I'd never thought that I would stay in that sector for so long. And so I decided to leave. And when I left, I thought I'd take a break and I didn't know what I would do next. And I had the opportunity to go back into a telecommunications company or take a role with the Edmonton Public Library. And the Edmonton Public Library intrigued me because I knew a bit about libraries, but not that much. And I wanted to do something different. So the idea of going back into telecommunications was less appealing than going and doing something in the public sector. And that's something that was really business, even though the library is not a business, but business to consumer. I was doing business to business for so long. The idea of dealing directly with people was way more attractive. And again, I thought, okay, I'll stay here for maybe 2 years because what could I possibly do at a public library? And 13 years later, a master's in library science later, and, a couple promotions into some really exciting work, I stayed there for quite a while. And it was really exciting. I had the chance to work with an amazing team and really change the perception of public libraries as one of the few institutions that really is for all people and really is the cornerstone or such a foundation for learning and education and community development for everyone. And that's really why I loved public libraries, and I still love public libraries. I think, as I said, they're one of the best institutions in the city. But it was really after that 13-year period, again, that I thought, I've done a lot of things here, and it's given me great opportunities and I have lots of ideas, but there's going to become a point where I don't feel so fresh anymore and where I feel like someone else would be in a better position to drive the organization in new ways and new directions. And so there was just time for a change for me. And, serendipitously, as I was thinking of that change, the CEO of the Edmonton Community Foundation reached out to me and let me know he was thinking of retiring, or he was going to retire. He wasn't thinking anymore. Now he knew he was going to retire. And he said, I think this would be a really good role for you. You should consider it. And we had talked a few years earlier and I hadn't considered it. It wasn't of interest to me. But when he approached me again, I thought, okay, this is the right time. And then I applied for the job and, a couple months later I got it and the rest is history.
Yeah. And here we are, a couple of years later. Yeah. So I've been with Edmonton Community Foundation now for 2 years. Fabulous organization, as you said, largest non-governmental funder of the charitable sector in the city. Endowment-based, so a really smart way for people to invest in the charitable sector rather than donations coming in and being expended right away. We invest that money, and then a portion of the money is given out each year in grants. That's allowed us to grow from, originally a $15 million endowment fund in 1989 that was granting $1 million to almost $900 million in assets under management and close to $40 million in granting this year. And that's only going to grow. That's the power. Again, accountants, we understand this. That's the power of compounding. It's the power of money over time. And I really love seeing that in practice and how that actually can help change and grow community. Absolutely. Yeah. So even though you're not working as a more traditional CPA, that obviously is coming into play in your work that you're doing now, and I'm assuming all along the way. Can you speak to how the skills you developed with your CPA designation have kind of benefited you throughout your career, even taking that less traditional path?
I think it's, is it chicken and egg? I have always been creative and analytical. So I think that's the piece that attracted me to the CPA in the first place, is that I have ideas. I like to think big. I like to blow things up. I like to think about how we can do something differently. But I am motivated and I am persuaded by logic and thoughtful consideration. And so that's what I think a CPA does. And actually, it was one of the things that I was surprised about particularly when I was doing my management accounting classes, is that it is a blend of creativity and analytics. I don't know that it always turns out that way in the practice of accounting, that people feel that that's how they behave when they are really a traditional accountant. I think that's what the education is meant to help us do, is to think both creatively and analytically and merge those two. So that's always been how I have been wired. So I think that's why why I was attracted to the CPA. I do think that has been the corner of all of my work, pre-CPA and then post. It only added to it post. The ability to have a very logical conversation with someone, have a very logical, fact-based discussion about why we should do something and use that logic to help move in a direction, but then also spend the time brainstorming what should we do. So I think that's really what I see as the strength of the CPA and why it spoke to me.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think you're right. So often people just view the analytical side. People just say, oh, you're good with numbers or that kind of thing. And it's actually, there is a lot of creativity. I mean, we don't want to do creative accounting necessarily. That's maybe a term we stay away from, but we do creative problem solving and innovation and that kind of thing to be business leaders, right? Thank you. So you're all about the opportunity, taking opportunities, and you've spoken a little bit about risk before. So I want to get into that. So CPAs, even, ones who aren't more like true accounting stream, spend a fair bit of time evaluating risk. And you've talked before about the importance of considering the flip side, which is reward. So too often I think leaders shy away from risk because they're just scared of risk, but even, the reward might be worth that risk. So I'm just curious, can you speak a little bit about your journey learning to find that balance between risk and reward and, what role it's played in your career? And if there's any maybe wins you want to share, stories from when you didn't avoid risk and it paid off.
Yeah, I think it's probably relative to what you're dealing with. And I've never been in the medical profession, for example. So would I be more risk intolerant if I was dealing with people's health and lives? Absolutely. But when you're talking about product development or going to bat for a customer or trying out some new ideas, I think we have a lot of room for risk tolerance. And especially then when you also look at the risk appetite within the budget that you have. So whether you're a corporation or a nonprofit, you have to manage the budget you have. So, you don't want to be so risky that you're putting yourself in jeopardy. But I think that's often not the issues that we're talking about. I think often we're talking about things that might take people's time. Or maybe there's some financial risk involved. Maybe there's a little reputational risk involved. But I really don't think anything big happens without taking that risk. So I've really, I'd probably say I'm pretty risk tolerant. So a couple examples. I remember when we rebranded the Edmonton Public Library, you'd think people wouldn't see that as risky. But at the time, our board was pretty concerned about the optics. We were going through a recession. So the optics of now the library presenting itself in a professional, what looks like a highly professional, highly designed way, what is the public perception going to be about that at a time of recession? So I get that risk concern. My argument was, none of what we've done has cost us any more money. We've done it all within the budget we have. I am willing to stand up and talk about the benefit of what we're doing. It makes the staff feel more proud. It makes customers feel more excited about the organization. It grows our awareness. And, especially in times of recession, libraries are even more important. It'll bring more people in. And it shows that we're fiscally responsible because we're using the money we have better than what we were doing before. But there was still that reluctance with it. And it was only because of the CEO at the time who said, we're moving in this direction. It's a good decision. It's my decision. And it was highly successful. So that's probably a simple example of risk and reward benefit. Another time when I was at Nortel, I was working in the hospitality sector. So I was responsible for large hospitality accounts around the world. And we had this high, really luxury brand hotel from Dubai that had started an initial account with us and was having some issues with a product. And the account team from Dubai was calling me to say, can you help? We're having issues getting any development. And there was so much reluctance from our technology team and the vendor they were working with to do some extra development to get the product to where it needed to be to meet that customer's need. The simple for me is it's a phone system that sat next to someone's bed in a hotel, a luxury hotel, that emitted this offensive blue light all night. So you're in a luxury hotel. You don't want to be kept awake by a blue light on your phone. It's very logical to me. But I could not convince the product team to see this as a problem and change it, that the change for this account would have benefit for all other hospitality customers because of the cost involved. They'd already spent the money they were supposed to spend on this account. They didn't want to spend any more. This was only a small deal at the time. They didn't want to invest more money in this initial, first purchase by this brand from Dubai. So they were really reluctant. So I convinced my director at that time in marketing to pay for the development or to put money into that development. And as a result, we made the fix. We got a $20 million contract with that account. That product was applied to others. So it's a small risk. It's a small investment. It's time from my standpoint. It's putting yourself out there from a reputation perspective, but the reward makes tons of sense.
Absolutely. Well, and it also really strengthened your reputation too, with that brand, obviously then coming back to you and also maybe some other organizations. You don't even necessarily see the full effect of it, right? That's great. Is it difficult though? Is it scary when you're kind of leaning into that risk? I know a lot of leaders tend to be very comfortable with the status quo, and I'm sure you've come up, even in your couple examples, you come up against that. But yeah, is there, for you, does that come naturally, or is there like a mental hurdle that you need to kind of get over to lean into that risk, even if it does make logical sense?
So feedback I got pretty early on in my career was I needed to pick my battles. And my pushback on that, so again, speaks to my personality, my pushback on it was I only pick the battles that I think are worth fighting, and most people pick no battles. I really felt like people concede too much, and if I think something is right, I'm going to fight for it. I have learned over time, I probably did need to pick more of my battles. I probably was challenging on too many things, but it is my personality for sure. Mm-hmm. And I do think it is that mix of logic and creativity. If I have an idea, if I think something can be better, if I know it can go in the right direction and I want to give it a try, I will use logic and persuasion to try and convince. And if people come back to me with emotion and illogic, I have a hard time with it. So that's where I would, I probably rise to those things and start to try and come up with other ways to say, okay, well, what about this? Or have you considered this, to logic it? So I am that way. I also have noticed every job I've had throughout my career, whether it was any of the positions I had at Nortel, my time at EPL, and even my time at the Edmonton Community Foundation, I'm not a person, an employee, a manager, a leader to come in for the status quo. If everything is running perfectly and no changes should be made, I'm not the right person for that role. If you want consideration for how things could be done better, if the organization is looking to move in other directions, those are the right roles for me. So that's why I think I have a better time or an easier time balancing risk and reward. And that's where I'll say again, all the things I've been talking about from a risk perspective are easier. They're not impacting whether people are housed or sleeping well that evening. They're not impacting whether children are suffering or people's medical or health is being impacted. I probably would have a much higher risk intolerance in those sectors. Most of the time, the work that I've been talking about, we have room to be risky because we can make improvements in lots of ways. And I think that's something that people have to factor in. Like, what really is the downside of this? Maybe it's a little bit of money. Maybe it's some time. Maybe it's some reputation. Can you manage those things? And if you can, is it worth it?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. So Brian Heshey, who of course is the reason that we have this podcast and the Heshey CPA Knowledge Center through his generous donation, he said in one of his books that he wrote, so much emphasis is put on the risk of sinking the boat. That is, on the possibility of suffering from potential negative outcomes. Have we lost sight of missing the boat? Mm-hmm. The possibility of reaping the benefits of positive outcomes.
What a great quote.
Yeah, I think that really sums things up, doesn't it?
Yeah. I resonate with that so much.
Yeah.
And I think the other is, again, like I said, how many times are you actually sinking the boat? Mm-hmm. Like there's probably, out of 100 decisions, there might be 2, or 100 opportunities, there might be 2 that would sink the boat. Those 98 aren't. And we often put them to the side.
Yeah. Absolutely. So you gave us a bit of a background about what the Edmonton Community Foundation is. Can you maybe give a little bit more on the role that it plays in supporting vulnerable Edmontonians?
So what's amazing about the Edmonton Community Foundation is it was started by community members for community. So it's the Poole family and the Stollery family, the founders of PCL Construction, that had the opportunity and wanted to give back to the city and had the opportunity to start their own private foundation, but were educated on the opportunity for a community foundation and instead decided to put their funding there. And what that means is that we support everything in the city. So whether it's environment, arts, music, healthcare, education, housing, all spectrums of charities receive funding from the Edmonton Community Foundation. There probably are very few charities in the city that haven't received funding from the Edmonton Community Foundation over the last 35 years. And there's not many organizations like ours. Many of the funders are very focused. They're focused on arts, they're focused on human services, they're focused on environment. We are really a 360 funder. So I think that's one of the benefits of what we do. I think it also allows us to have a depth of knowledge about the whole need of the city and how arts and education integrates, how human services and environment integrate. We can see those connections because we're dealing with all of the organizations that support those areas. So that's been a real strength of the Edmonton Community Foundation over the last several years. And again, the benefit too is that because it's a community foundation, Edmontonians provide the funding that we steward and manage. And they can then either work with us to decide where that funding goes, or they can direct it themselves and say, I lost a loved one to cancer. I really am invested in cancer research, and I want to make sure that in my lifetime and for generations to come, research around cancer is going to continue.
Yeah. That's amazing. Having that broad view, like you say, gives you such a unique perspective and an important one. Is it overwhelming at times, though? Like it's a lot.
It is a lot. We've got a pretty fabulous granting team and philanthropy team. So it is a unique entity. There are very few organizations that operate this broadly. So I do think it can be overwhelming. I think the thing that we are looking towards with our strategic plan is how we can help narrow our focus a little bit. We'll still be a 360 funder. We'll still support all areas, but can we take parts of our funding and say there are needs and opportunities in the city, and an organization like ours is going to invest in them for a sustained period of time to see if we can dissolve those problems or create opportunities that weren't there before. That's a change for us. And I think it's a real opportunity because unlike most funders who raise their money every year and are in that cycle of always having to find new funding, we aren't that way because of our endowment model. We have a sustainable source of funding that maintains itself. So if we raised not another dollar, if not a single donor came to the Edmonton Community Foundation ever again, we would still have money that we can grant. And that's a really powerful place to be as far as the impact it can have in the city. We can continue to give back to Edmonton year over year for generations, whether we raise another dollar or not. So I think that gives us a lot of strength. And I think that's where myself, the board, we are interested in seeing how can we use that strength to say where are there opportunities in the city that an organization like ours can really help.
Yeah, absolutely. That's amazing. So does the work that ECF does in our community also support the private sector as well? Like, is there any interconnectedness to kind of that flow?
There's a few connections. I mean, first of all, many of our donors are from the private sector. We have many businesses that have funds with the Edmonton Community Foundation, and I think that's a fantastic way that they look at how they give back to community. They can start a fund with us. That fund can grow over time. It can create awareness for them, for themselves. Their fund will be named for them in perpetuity. So there's a lot of benefit for that. But I think the other is understanding how the nonprofit or even social profit, let's be clear, this is a sector that provides so much value to community. The social profit and the for-profit sector are inherently linked. If we have a housing crisis, if we have poverty, if we have, an opioid epidemic and people on the streets, that negatively impacts business. That negatively impacts downtown vibrancy. That prevents people from wanting to come to Edmonton to start a life here. So these are inevitably linked. I heard another story from one of our founding donors about why their family wanted to invest in building a symphony in Edmonton. And the story was so beautiful because it talks about if you have a symphony, then you have musicians. If you have musicians, those musicians create communities of smaller musicians. Like you have a trio that then brings other people in who learn about music. Then you bring culture to a city. That's an attractive thing that grows the value of a city. So I think the for-profit and the social profit sector are inherently linked because one can't survive without the other. So I do want to change the narrative around that. And even the word charity, the connotation is that it's a handout versus it's using resources that are provided for community good. All the things that charities do, arts. Our arts sector is charity, is the nonprofit, is the charitable sector. Our human services sector, our education, these are all nonprofits and charities. Our communities won't survive without them. Our communities won't be the same without them. So I do think it's imperative for the business community to understand why the nonprofit and charitable sector is so vital for them.
Absolutely. Thank you. So, of course, in your position as CEO with ECF, you have a really good perspective on the importance of philanthropy, of giving. So, you talk about wanting to change that narrative and that kind of perspective. What do you think are the factors presently that motivate and inspire people to donate, to volunteer, to give back in various ways?
Well, I think people are part of the communities they live in. So, when you see that, or your kids participate in some fantastic course that they took through, the Citadel, or they attend a program at the library, or they go and see, Disney on the Square from the Windspear. Those things are all provided by charities and nonprofits. Similarly, when we see people on the street or, there's a a call out because Boyle Street Community Services and Bissell Centre are seeing more homeless people being unsheltered. That speaks to us as people who live here, who work here in all sorts of sectors. And so I think those are the things that drive philanthropists. There's been a bit of a narrative, unfortunately, portrayed recently a little bit by some of the political parties that philanthropists are motivated by self-interest and tax receipts and avoiding paying taxes. And those are certainly benefits, and they are certainly, lures that the government has put in place over time to encourage people to support charitable giving. It's not the motivator. I haven't met a single person, and we say philanthropist as though, it's an elitist group. You and I are philanthropists. If you give $20 to something, you are a philanthropist. We aren't motivated by the tax receipts. It can provide some value for sure, and it's an incentive, but it's not our motivation. Our motivation is we want better communities, and I firmly believe that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, like you say, it's an incentive. It's a help. Maybe it makes it more accessible for someone when they're like, oh, I can donate this. It'll improve my community, and I'll get a little bit of it back when it comes to tax time, right? And yeah, like you say, it's about building community, and it's about the human connection aspect of it that really drives it. I think that's bang on.
Every single person benefits from the charitable and the nonprofit sector. Schools, universities, hospitals, theater, music, arts, that's all the nonprofit sector. So to think that we can survive without it is foolish.
Absolutely.
And even to think that we can survive, let alone thrive. Like the things that give us joy in our lives, like the arts and music and culture, it's all provided by the charitable sector. So these are the things I think that people understand and motivates them to support the services that they use and they love.
Yeah. So today, what do you see as kind of the highest priorities for community support in Edmonton, across the province? Where are the greatest areas of need?
Well, there's a few. I mean, we're in a bit of a challenging time because there is, I would say, almost emergencies in many areas. Food bank usage is up beyond any statistics that they've seen before across the country. The affordable housing and the lack of housing, whether it's affordable for students and newcomers to, we've got people with mental health and addiction problems that are also unhoused. So the affordable housing and the housing challenge is quite large. And then on the other side, we see, the arts sector struggling post-COVID. They had some support during COVID, but a lot of the audiences haven't gone back to the levels they were at pre-COVID because there's still a little bit of that reluctance and fear. And then there's the growth of many of the kind of services and entertainment venues that are now streaming into people's homes. So there's a struggle in many of those areas. And so I know the charitable sector is working through how to deal with these challenges in many ways. I think for the Edmonton Community Foundation, how we are thinking about it is root cause issues. And, I heard this great poem when I was in the UK, and it's called The Ambulance at the End of the Valley. And it talks about how people are falling off a cliff, and the decision by the community is to put an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. And as you can see right away, the moral of the poem is put a fence at the top of the cliff. And so that's how the Edmonton Community Foundation is thinking right now. There are many, many charities and many organizations dealing in emergency crisis right now. How do we prevent ourselves from being in crisis all the time? How do we look at what root cause issues there are? And an organization like ours can invest in them now and over time so that in 10 years, those same issues that are plaguing us today are less acute, that we put things in place to not always be in crisis management. So that's the thing that I'm thinking about. I do think, generally the charitable sector right now is struggling in many ways. Mm-hmm. If you look at any of the recent research that's been done nationally, donations are down. And it's because people are struggling themselves, from an affordability perspective. They're struggling with lots of things, so their ability to contribute to charities has reduced. So charities are suffering from rising challenges that they're dealing with and lower funding that's coming their way. So for some people, the answer to that is for organizations like ECF to just put more money into emergency. And I think that's short-sighted. I don't want us to always be in emergency resolution mode. So we're trying to think of what are some of the root causes here. Can we invest in them over time and see that those challenges become less in the future for our children, for our children's children? But that takes patience. That's a risk. I think that's back to the risk and the reward. I think it's a risk to go in that direction, but that is a much bigger reward.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, Edmonton Community Foundation is in a position to be able to do that because of the structure, because of the endowment model. You're able to, yes, invest in some of the kind of more emergency type stuff, but also be proactive to make long-term change and make it more sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned a little bit how the pandemic is still really impacting the arts sector. We're even seeing it within the profession, kind of the impact of coming out of the pandemic still having an impact. How did COVID-19 pandemic affect the area of philanthropy, volunteerism, people's interest in supporting those community causes? And are we still seeing those impacts?
Yeah, on two big components, COVID is still having an impact on our contributions to the charitable sector. One is donations, as I've described. So donations are definitely down post-COVID. And again, there's multiple factors that are contributing to that, but affordability is probably the biggest one. I think it's also a change in demographic. There's, millennials are at this point are less philanthropic than the generations before them. And I think it's a little bit of the education about the importance of philanthropy and what philanthropy can do in community, but also that desire to have a better understanding. There's more critical thinking around where their money is going. So there's a little bit of that's happening. Yeah, the other thing that we are seeing is that volunteerism post-COVID is also down. So COVID certainly had people stay home and created a little bit more fear in being in large groups and being in close proximity to people. And it's been hard for many charities to get a lot of those volunteers back. So that's been, we've received funding requests to do studies, to do work, to figure out how do we help bring volunteers back to many of the charities that had relied on them.
Absolutely. Well, and I think part of it too, even if the kind of fear that kept people back initially, or even if there wasn't fear, there was, regulations and rules and things like that. Even if that is gone, we're creatures of habit in so many ways, right? So it's just not in the routine anymore. Something else filled that.
That's totally fair.
And, so just kind of needing to get back in the habit, I guess.
Yeah, it's true. It's just like the habits that we had of going into the workspace, like coming downtown to go to work or going to get your coffee at this place because you're at your workspace. Yeah, we've changed our habits. Our behaviors have changed. And I suspect that volunteering is one of those areas that will need to be reintegrated into people's lives. And I hope that people will see that the need is still there and in consideration of, changing that habit in the future.
Absolutely. So some people say, they don't volunteer. They don't think they have any skills to offer. They can't, help with what the need is. So what would you say to someone who feels that way, but still does want to help out?
We just had a presentation from Project Adult Literacy at our board meeting yesterday. And Monica Das, who's the executive director there, talked about how there are so many people who have low literacy as adults, and it prevents them from flourishing in life. It kills their confidence. It makes them think they're less than everybody else. And she talks about how, they have about 150 volunteers that they work with. And her comment was, anyone can volunteer. If you are kind and considerate and want to help someone learn how to read and write, they will provide the training to you to make sure that you can do that. And I think that's a really great message. Most organizations that are looking for volunteers will, one, train you and aren't asking you to do highly sophisticated things. Everybody has a skill that they can provide. I'll say on the other side, I think there are opportunities for people with professional expertise in their day jobs to apply that for the charitable sector. I'm part of the Mayor's Housing Task Force, and we've been talking about how many of the nonprofit housing providers or some of the charities that are quite small, they don't have the abundance of budget, staff, or shared services expertise. So could a CPA, could an accountant with really specialized skills help monumentally move a charity forward by spending a little time with them to help them understand how finance and accounting can help their work? I think that is the case. Mm-hmm. And I think there could be more opportunities for us to look at how we partner people with high expertise with organizations in need of that expertise without it being a job, like really being a volunteer opportunity. Because I think a lot of the volunteer opportunities we look at are, volunteering to pack a box or drive someone. So they are lower skills. But if we have people with high skills, like I think about the CPA organization, these are people with high skills. Well, how do we get them to use their high skills in their day jobs to support organizations that are doing really important community work and can't find the resources, don't have the budget, don't have the staffing to be able to get the support that they need? And I think that's maybe a missing volunteer opportunity that I would love to explore.
Absolutely. All right, we are running out of time here. So maybe one more question for you. We are, middle of December here already. This season is sometimes referred to as the season of giving. Do you notice an increase in, volunteerism, donations, that desire to give back around this time of year?
I'd say every charity sees a big increase in donations. We do about 20%, maybe more, 20% of our donations in probably less than 10 days of the year.
Wow.
So it's a big hockey stick in December. And a lot of that is tax receipt year end.
Get it in before December 31st.
Yeah. So again, let's not diminish that it is a motivation. It's not the deciding factor, but it's a motivation. And so when people see that okay, if I get it in this year, I can use it for my taxes next year, it really is a motivation. So I'm sure that is a universal message for all charities across the city. So yes, we are definitely seeing an increase.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for speaking so eloquently about your work and about philanthropy and just sharing your wisdom with us. It's been a pleasure talking with you and learning more about the importance of helping in the community and kind of the various ways that we can do that, even if, a few different things I hadn't thought about. So thank you. And of course, thank you for the work that you and your team do to help make our community a better place for everyone.
Thank you.
One more thing before I close off this episode of Uncommon Sense. On behalf of the entire team that puts this podcast together each week, I wish all of our listeners a happy, safe, and warm holiday season. Thank you for listening week after week. We'll be taking a bit of a holiday break and we'll be back with a new episode on January 9th. We will see you then.
The Uncommon Sense podcast is presented by the CPA Education Foundation and funded by the Heshi CPA Knowledge Center. The Knowledge Center was created through a generous donation to the CPA Education Foundation by the late Brian Heshi. Brian was a distinguished Albertan, business leader, CPA, educator, and community builder. His generosity and commitment to education underpinned his good works across Alberta throughout his lifetime. We would like to acknowledge that the CPA Education Foundation offices are situated on the traditional Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 territories and Métis Nation homeland. The Foundation acknowledges that we reside on traditional and ancestral territories of many Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Their histories and culture influence our community to this day. The CPA Education Foundation is committed to helping build a province where Indigenous people and their voices and experiences are heard, valued, respected, and celebrated. Technical and recording services for this podcast provided by Wolf Willow Studios in Edmonton. If you enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to like, subscribe, and tell your friends about us. If you have any comments on the podcast, write to us at cpaef@cpaalberta.ca. To learn more about the CPA Education Foundation and the Heshi CPA Knowledge Center, visit cpaalberta.ca/foundation. Thanks for listening.